All right, guys, welcome back from our short intermission. We have joining us next, Professor and Architect Brandon Rowe from Utah Valley University. You guys are seeing his presentation here. I can see his face on the screen here. I wonder if I can potentially, let's bring him over down in the corner. Okay, there he is. Like I said, Brandon is coming to us from Utah Valley University. Appreciate him joining virtually today. He is a licensed architect and an educator, an award-winning architect from AIA, USGBC, even Walt Disney Imagineering, and over at Utah Valley University. It sounds like he is co-authoring a new professional program over there. So congratulations to you guys. We're very familiar with that process, just having completed it not too long ago. And so I'm happy now to turn over the floor to Professor Brandon Rowe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I wish I could see all of your bright smiling faces, but we'll have to do this virtually today. Hopefully at another opportunity we'll be able to meet in person. Today my title for my presentation is Beauty and Transcendence in Architecture. And I'm approaching this with possibly 4 ideals for our secular age and how we can move through this some of the challenges that we're faced with. But to begin with, we live in a day and age in which the built environment plays a critical role in either nourishing or diminishing our cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, and emotional health and well-being. Because of this, the Finnish architect Juhani Pallasmaa has said more than ever before, the ethical and humane task of architecture and all art is to defend the authenticity and autonomy of human experience. And secondly, to reveal the existence of the transcendental realm, the domain of the sacred. Now, finding beauty and the sacred in a secular age can be difficult, especially when considering the cultural milieu that is drowning ourselves in narcissism, in consumerism, and in hedonism. Likewise, we have agnostic and atheistic philosophies that dominate both our modern culture and our schools of architecture. And because of this, Karsten Harries, the Yale philosopher, argues that our built environment speaks of a culture that has literally banished the sacred to the periphery of our modern lives. While this may be the case, Charles Taylor argues that the secular age does force individuals to confront notions of both belief and unbelief. And thus it is our unique privilege living in a culturally diverse and predominantly democratic world that enables us to choose for ourselves based on evidence, history, and faith, rather than always popular ideologies. Now, in addition to this belief-unbelief paradox that we have in the secular age, we find yet another conundrum. Philosophers and theologians tend to agree that beauty and transcendence are inextricably linked to the sacred. The transcendent is tied to the eternal, and that goes beyond our ordinary profane world. Likewise, beauty also gives us hope of a perfected heavenly realm. Yet all 3 of these qualities tend to be rejected by our contemporary culture and profession. Many have come to embrace an architecture of ugliness and absence rather than transcendence and beauty. This has continued our downward spiral towards what we would call a desacralized profane world. But why? In his book titled Beauty, the philosopher Roger Scruton argues that many in our contemporary culture have a desire to spoil beauty in acts of aesthetic iconoclasm. But he goes on and explains that we actually there's a human need for beauty. It's not something that we could lack and still be fulfilled as a people. It is a need arising from our metaphysical condition. So what he explains is that the experience of beauty also points us beyond this world. The feeling for beauty is proximate to the religious frame of mind, arising from a humble sense of living with imperfections while aspiring towards the highest unity with the transcendental, with God. According to Roger Scruton, both art and architecture stand on this threshold of the transcendental. Perhaps it is because significant architecture makes us experience ourselves as complete embodied and spiritual beings. This is argued by Juhani Pallasmaa. When ordinary people observe how things appear, they make judgments of what they deem beautiful or visually pleasing. Whether we're looking at art and architecture, our reactions can at times vary based on our socio-cultural backgrounds, our age, gender, education, etc. Scholars often refer to this as the phenomenology of aesthetic experience. But not surprisingly, architects will often see the world differently than others because they are trained to see the world in a certain way and taught how to make judgments of what is good design. Now, we have a paradox here. Most visual preference surveys on architectural styles and buildings reveal that people prefer traditional buildings versus modern-looking ones. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? If people prefer traditional architecture over modern designs, then why are many schools of architecture not teaching students to have an open perspective, to maybe design buildings that will give them more clients and job security? Part of that answer might be rooted in significant philosophical and ideological changes that took place in the architectural education at the beginning of the 20th century. The modern movement oftentimes tried to obliterate all ties to history and the past. But applying these lessons to the secular age, we can ask ourselves, how can architects really attempt to transcend the mundane, the ordinary, through beauty? Can the domain of the sacred be revealed through beauty? How might these principles be taught to the next generation of architects? So I seek to answer these difficult questions by examining 4 ideals and how they might help us address beauty and transcendence in architecture. So let's begin. The first one, aesthetics and designing with beauty. At our new program at Utah Valley University, we celebrate the creative process. We teach our students to cultivate their imagination, refine their craft, and design with beauty in mind. So what is beauty, and how does one go about teaching it? Well, the ancient Athenian culture around 450 BC counted beauty among the ultimate values of a society. Their architects worked closely with artists, sculptors, and master builders to develop an aesthetic system with the express purpose of creating an experience of beauty. The result, we could argue, is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. Around 400 years later, the Roman architect Vitruvius writes in his treatise on architecture that good architecture must possess 3 things, and one of those 3 pillars is beauty, venustas. So what is beauty then? 1400 years after Aristotle and Plato created several definitions for beauty, Alberti emerges in the Renaissance to revive these definitions. He says, I shall define beauty to be a harmony of all the parts, in whatsoever subject it appears, fitted together with such proportion and connection that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered, but for the worse. So beauty appears to be some kind of harmony between parts, proportions. Everything is interconnected. Now, looking to the past, Alberto Pérez Gómez reminds us that the Renaissance cosmology believed that number and geometry were a link between the human and the divine. Others, influenced by Newtonian transcendental thought, argued that by observing these immutable mathematical laws of natural phenomenon, architects would be able to design with beauty and thereby approach divinity. The question we ask ourselves in the 21st century is whether these relationships of parts and whole can still be considered a good definition of beauty. Is beauty an objective, measurable quality? Is it in the brain of the beholder, or is it subjective, a product of the observer's perception in the eye of the beholder? Breakthroughs in evidence-based design, neuroscience, aesthetics, and environmental psychology are beginning to hold architects to a higher level of accountability regarding architecture's effect on well-being via the experience of beauty. So let me share one example. Neuroscience and research is beginning to confirm that beauty is actually not in the eye of the beholder, as we once thought, but it's in our biological brains. Cultural norms do not play as much of a factor as some philosophers and contemporary artists would have us believe. Ugliness is actually located in a different part of the brain than something that gives us pleasure. According to the neurobiology research by Semir Zeki and his team, fMRI brain scans are revealing that when people listen to beautiful music or look at beautiful images, a singular part of the brain is activated, known as the medial orbital frontal cortex. Thus, beauty is experienced mechanically through some of our senses. Now, beauty also nourishes our emotional brain. And Zeki and his team argue that we seek the beautiful in order to nourish our emotional brain. The experience of pleasure, reward, and desire are central to that activity of the emotional brain. So he concludes that design should really have beauty as a main focal point if it aims to ever enhance the human experience. Zeki's team concludes that the universality of architectural beauty probably lies in satisfying inherited brain concepts of proportion, harmony, and geometric relationships that are more formally expressed in mathematical terms. Now, this should not come as a shock, since new studies are revealing that looking at fractal structures can reduce physiological stress in human beings. Professor Emeritus of Biology at Harvard explains that humans have this innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes, and biophilia is simply the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. Similar to the ancient Greeks, the ultimate guidebook for design becomes nature itself. As the math educator Michael Schneider explains, nature itself rests on an internal foundation of archetypal principles, symbolized by numbers, shapes, and their arithmetic and geometric relationships. These can be found in the smallest subatomic particles to the largest galactic clusters, crystals, plants, fruits, and vegetables, weather patterns, and animal and human bodies. So at Utah Valley University, we begin by grounding our students in some of these timeless and tested design principles, patterns, proportions, geometries inherent in both nature and the classical tradition of architecture. They continue to apply these throughout their education, especially in the design of religious projects, of sacred spaces. Here are two examples of their projects that are looking at the Abrahamic traditions. Now, with all of this, the aspiration to fuse the cosmic and the human, divine and mortal, spiritual and material, combined with the use of systems of proportion and material, deriving simultaneously from the cosmic order and human figure, this is what gave architectural geometries their meaning and deep sense of spiritual life, argued by Juhani Pallasmaa. So the only way we can restore meaning to architecture and design with beauty, therefore, is to slow down and study the patterns of creation. In the words of Roger Scruton, it's when we pause to study the perfect form of a wildflower or the blended feathers of a bird, you experience an enhanced sense of belonging. A world that makes room for such things makes room for you. In fact, our aesthetic interest in natural beauty has a transfiguring effect because the experience has a metaphysical resonance with us. According to Scruton, it's in the experience of beauty the world comes home to us, and we to the world. For the believer, these universal patterns that are found in nature are really vestiges of divine design. They're the fingerprints of an all-wise architect of the cosmos. Now, the second ideal for the secular age demands that architects evaluate their ethical and professional duties in building in ways that affirm the authenticity of human experience and honor the cultural diversity found in the traditions we all have inherited. Now, building off definitions from anthropology, the social sciences, culture is often described as values, symbols, behaviors, beliefs, customs, and traditions of a racial, religious, or social group. These are often manifest in language, cuisine, dance, music, art, and architecture. Now, here in Utah, we strive to teach our students about the importance of cultural diversity by helping them appreciate other perspectives, traditions, beliefs, customs, and places. We strive to help them see beyond their own worldview by cultivating their empathic imagination, increasing their compassion for the building user, and promoting humility to learn from other traditions. Now, one of the ways we teach students these principles is by going out and measuring and drawing buildings that are part of our shared heritage. These processes become a form of embodied learning, whereby proportions, details, unique features become internalized through this process of seeing, measuring, feeling, and drawing. Now, with that embodied knowledge of the past, our students strive to imitate the principles of a great heritage instead of just copying the mannerisms of one's predecessors or contemporaries, as argued by the Greek architect Dimitri Porphyrios. As we learn from anthropology, culture is both verbal and nonverbal language. When we look at culture in the built environment, there is usually a unique genus loci, or spirit of place, that can be found around the world. When we look at these images from Paris, can we get a sense of place? What about these images from Beijing, China? Or maybe a little closer to home, what about these images from Washington, D.C.? Now, when we contrast these to projects that use a zeitgeist approach to design that is of its time, buildings tend to distance themselves from the past in favor of novelty, ephemeral pleasurability, consumable iconographic individualism, and unmediated industrial production. According to Dimitri Porphyrios, this leaves us yearning for an authentic culture. Good architecture, then, should reinforce and perpetuate tradition to some degree. As Juhani Pallasmaa explains, tradition is an astounding sedimentation of images and experiences, and it cannot be invented. It can only be lived. It constitutes an endless excavation of layered, internalized, and shared myths, memories, images, and experiences. So here in Utah, we teach our students to honor and preserve the spirit of a place, its culture, traditions, memories, and history. We study architectural precedents and case studies to learn from the past and address design challenges in a culturally and contextually sensitive way. we teach students the importance of approaching the design process with empathy, compassion, and humility, so one might build upon the past and preserve the embodied history of architecture. This can be evidenced in a recent design studio project where students had to contemplate designing a new hotel on the historic Grand Canal in Venice, Italy. So why is this important? Yale Professor Emeritus of Philosophy Karsten Harries argues that as human beings, we have a need to not only locate ourselves in space, but also in time. As a result, he warns architects of the need to defeat this terror of time before our culture loses its sense of place. Now, neuroscience and other biometric tools are revealing why these types of architectural designs might not be good for public health, let alone defending the authentic culture of a place. So a great illustration of the difference between deliberate randomness and coherent design might be seen in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Daniel Liebeskin's Behind the Lines design is a reinterpretation of German Jewish history. Meanwhile, the older Baroque palace has a more comprehensive, ordered, and harmonious design, especially when we see where visual attention lands by using eye-tracking emulation software. Now, similarly, we can see this point in the Military History Museum in Dresden, also by Libeskind. You could say this bold, flashy architectural move may shock us at first, but it does not actually hold our attention as human beings, as demonstrated by the percentages there on the screen. So good architecture always is contextual, as Juhani Pallasmaa relates. Great works achieve their density and depth from the echo of the past, whereas the voice of the products of superficial novelty remains feeble, incomprehensible, and meaningless. The first responsibility of the architect, then, is always to that inherited landscape or urban setting. So the third ideal that we'll focus on is critically looking at technology. We should promote creative problem solving by equipping students with the technical skills to address the needs of the 21st century, while at the same time teaching students to think about building for time as a truly sustainable practice. Now, the digital information age has provided architects with incredible tools, such as augmented reality, parametric design, and building information modeling. If we put too much faith in such tools, however, it can lead us away from the sacred. Because designers have, in some cases, fallen in love with the computerized design process, a sort of technophilia, some modern buildings tend to read as repulsively plastic, unreal, immaterial, digital, or sharp-edged on the one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, however, architecture marked by too much simplicity, efficiency, density, or uniformity can turn into another form of industrialized kitsch. So instead of succumbing to the aesthetics of speed, newness, consumerism, architects should focus on the durability of time-tested materials and assemblies, the long-term function and reuse potential of buildings themselves, as well as the embodied energy of materials used for construction. This dialogue appears to be catching on at some of the top institutions around the country, such as the Harvard Graduate School of Design, that held a seminar in fall of 2021 titled Thicker. The seminar questioned the all too popular technique of using all glass curtain walls in modern architecture from a sustainability standpoint, and really critically reassessed older, thicker, energy efficient facades found on historic structures. Building in time, we consider the adaptive reuse potential of historic structures instead of tearing them down. We can see this in the reuse of Michigan's oldest fire department, built in 1929, that was transformed into a new boutique hotel, or the 1924 Ogden Union Station that was converted into a series of museums. Now, Roger Scruton challenges the form follows function. He says, when it comes to beautiful architecture, function follows form. Beautiful buildings change their uses. Merely functional buildings get torn down. In other words, when we take beauty seriously, function ceases to be an independent variable and becomes absorbed into the aesthetic goal. Now, some may accuse me and others of attacking technological design tools, or say we have this technophobia, right? On the contrary, we fully embrace technological tools and the creative problem solving of architectural design. What we encourage is that students resist the urge to immediately jump into a computerized design process by continuing to use their hands. Now, neuroscience is revealing there are important hand, eye, and mind connections that are critical for young architects to develop before diving into a mathematical space of the computer world. But this is not to say that these digital innovative tools should be completely rejected, right? There might be a hybrid approach. We can view these tools as means to an end instead of ends in themselves. So an example might be going from a hand sketch to creating a digital drawing, to then creating a sculpted clay mold, creating a 3D digital scan, go into a CNC fabrication, and then hand touching the carved stone in the end product. But here in Utah, we sometimes approach this by having our students literally carve in clay several ornamental motifs or details, creating rubber molds and plaster casts, so that they are familiar with the hundreds of surrogate hands in traditional crafts and trades that are bringing the architect's vision to life. Now, the task of architecture is not to shock, critique, amaze, or entertain, argues Juhani Pallasmaa, but it is to provide us with our foothold in the realm of the real, and thus lay the foundation for a critical position to culture and life. We want our students to think about what legacy their contemporary buildings will leave on those to come. They need to build for time by thinking their projects in terms of generations instead of decades. And in this, I'm reminded of this fascinating quote by John Ruskin. He says, "Therefore, when we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think, as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred, because our hands have touched them. And that men will say, as they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them, see, this our fathers did for us." Lastly, we turn our focus to well-being and inspiring the spirit. In order for architects to inspire the human spirit, we must focus on creating environments that enrich the human experience by nourishing cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, and emotional health and well-being. Architecture is called to do a lot more than guarantee the public health, safety, and welfare of building users, argues Julio Bermudez, professor at the Catholic University of America. At its highest, architecture has the ability to turn geometric proportions into shivers, stone into tears, rituals into revelation, light into grace, space into contemplation, and time into divine presence. Now, according to the late comparative historian of religion, Lindsay Jones, significant spiritual experiences or events in architecture are comprised of three key players. The architects that produce the built forms, number one, the religious specialists that produce ceremonial occasions for gathering, and the human participants that come with their expectations and belief. And when these combined, we often get a transformative experience that affects our human understanding, what he terms a ritual architectural event. What is a transformative human experience? Sometimes it's a powerful experience in architecture. It can transform and affect us on the metaphysical, social, political, psychological, religious, or pedagogical levels. Now, what Dr. Bermudez is describing, and Lindsay Jones, is how architecture can ultimately affect our body, minds, and spirits based on concepts found in Eastern religions and the Christian tradition. Yet recent breakthroughs in neuroscience have also taught us that the aesthetic experience of architecture is tied to our behavioral, emotional, and cognitive processes. Now, you've probably heard the term nature versus nurture. And in our aesthetic experiences, our culture, our knowledge does have an effect on how we experience places. But also we have biological systems that are coming into play. For instance, whenever we're confronted with an environment or visual stimuli, our brain must quickly determine if it is threatening or rewarding. Environments that are threatening can cause us to be distracted, anxious, stressed, or reduce our productivity. On the other hand, an environment that is rewarding, or we could say beautiful, will cause us to be more creative, collaborative, focused, resilient, and positive. Now we can see this, that the architect's decisions matter a lot. Take, for instance, this classic study from 1984, where Roger Ulrich concluded that a patient's view through a window might influence their recovery from surgery. An architect seeking to apply evidence to the design process for a new hospital might carefully place the building so that the patient has views to nature versus a brick wall. A similar 1986 NASA study also found a similar effect. In measuring skin conductance and people's physiological responses to different images, those that were abstract, non-fractal designs actually increased stress, while those with fractal patterns were reported to reduce stress. And so similar lessons could be applied to buildings. And we learned this from psychologists and from other factors. One psychologist in Canada isolated volunteers in cubicles and either reduced sensory input to a minimum level, sensory deprivation, or presented subjects with unpatterned stimuli at a constant level. Now, after 4 hours, these individuals found difficulty in rational thinking, and after 48 hours, most reported hallucinating. Now, other studies reveal how completely white rooms can lead to similar results and are actually deemed as a form of torture. So if these types of environments can potentially be damaging to our health, why is it that some architects still insist on designing minimalist architectural spaces, let alone minimalist designs for religious spaces? Now, some pilot studies using eye tracking software are revealing that human beings simply do not fixate on either minimalist, monotonous, or deliberately random buildings. Those fail to draw our unconscious attention. Our eye has to be attracted first to fixate on a building's facade, and only then can the brain apply analytical techniques to process the visual signal. Now, such a strong preference in human beings for fractal patterns that are found in traditional architecture can be seen in the recent 2020 visual preference survey conducted by the Harris Poll and the National Civic Arts Society. What this survey found is that 72% of Americans, and this included majorities across political, racial, gender, and socioeconomic lines, preferred traditional architecture for U.S. courthouses and federal buildings. Here's one example from the survey. The Hanson Federal Building in Ogden, Utah was only favored by a third of participants, whereas the traditional U.S. courthouse in Toledo, Ohio, was favored by 2/3 of participants. Now, one of my UVU architecture students and I decided to use an AI-based eye tracking software to actually see if these results were valid. So we took that same pairing of images, we ran this through an experiment, and it confirmed the original survey responses. It demonstrated how certain fractal patterns found on the traditional building on the right captured the unconscious attention better than the monotonous modern building on the left. Now, a separate pair of researchers at the Human Architecture and Planning Institute recently found a similar finding, but this time they actually used real people. Tracking people's eye movements using eye motion software, 62 individuals that participated in this study were able to demonstrate that most of the eye gaze fixated on the traditional building versus the modern one. And so, and this was even though the images were flipped themselves. So although the hierarchy and classical proportions of the traditional courthouse hold people's attention, we have to ask ourselves, how are we designing and how is it going to affect human beings? We can also apply this to our religious structures. When we apply the same eye tracking simulation methods to the analysis of religious buildings, designs that possess fractal patterns, proportions, geometries, they hold our attention. Because these structures are tied to beauty and transcendence, they are more prone to inspire the human spirit. This is most apparent when we compared to the fragmented and wandering visual gaze caused by some expressionist religious structures. For many talented agnostic architects, explains Duncan Stroik, the goal may be an architecture of absence rather than transcendence. This, he explains, is because the concept of transcendence in architecture implies belief in an invisible reality that is not materially quantifiable. Place-centered well-being is achieved through learning from the past, but also using these latest breakthroughs in modern science that now enable our students to design for promoting cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, and emotional health and well-being. So in conclusion, as we focus on these four ideals for the secular age, future architects can begin the process of cultivating their empathic imagination, their compassion for the building user, and their ability to create a durable, useful, and beautiful built environment that promotes health and well-being for generations to come. Now, the sacred continues to need architecture if it is not to wither. Architecture, on the other hand, also needs the sacred if it is not to wither. This is an argument by the philosopher Karsten Harries. Now, in this presentation, we have learned that beauty and transcendence are also woven into this tapestry of the sacred, but they have a symbiotic relationship with architecture. So in conclusion and end this presentation, these relationships make Juhani Pallasmaa's charge to architects that we began with even more vital for the future of the profession. As he said, more than ever before, the ethical and humane task of architecture and all art is to defend the authenticity and autonomy of human experience and to reveal the existence of the transcendental realm, the remain of the sacred. Thank you.